Welcome. This series is going to be the most comprehensive set of presentations that currently exists on this subject and military doctrine. We're just going to do a quick introduction to the series and then jump right into it. So, what is Field Manual 3-24? Well, it's the U.S. military doctrine used around the world in counter operations. These counter operations, utilizing all or just parts of 3-24, include countering violent extremism, or CVE, counterinsurgency, or COIN, and counterterrorism. So think of extremism and terrorism on a spectrum, progressing through violence, with insurgency closer to the side of terrorism and directed towards a government. Now, we're going to come back to exactly where insurrection fits onto this spectrum in just a moment. So while the vastness of means and the intensity of the efforts may vary between how violent extremism is countered versus, let's say, how terrorism is countered, they all utilize this FM 3-24 doctrine, aspects of which now being used on U.S. soil on domestic U.S. citizens through U.S. government agencies, NGOs, private corporations, media organizations, etc., etc. This is known as a whole of government approach, or WOG. The first aspect to understanding how all of this domestic military shenanigans first started is understanding the ecosystem of countering violent extremism within the U.S. that utilize information operations and other aspects of this military doctrine. Countering violent extremism is simply under the broader umbrella of the military's stability operations, or SO, aiming to establish long-term peace and long-term stability in regions affected by conflict or instability. So now this countering violent extremism ecosystem technically first started on U.S. soil in 2013 out of the CSCC within the U.S. State Department shortly after the repeal of the Smith-Mundt Act. Now, the Smith-Mundt Act was the only legislation that banned state-sponsored influence operations from being conducted on U.S. citizens. Now, these influence operations are conducted through a field known as strategic communications. Now, material support by the Department of Defense and the U.S. military on these domestic counter operations that utilize military doctrine was first permitted in 2016 with the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017, or NDAA of 2017, along with the CSCC's reformation into the GEC that same year. And it was this NDAA 2017 that first authorized the U.S. State Department and its GEC to take this same whole of government approach in domestic stability operations that the U.S. military takes in its own stability operations abroad, both using the same military doctrine. Now, if you'd like to know more about the origins of these domestic hybrid state/military counter operations, I have another video series titled The Military-Industrial Complexities that goes into this a little bit further. And if you'd like to know more about strategic communications or cognitive warfare and exactly how it's possible to create Manchurian candidates solely using data and artificial intelligence, I've published multiple books on this that also address its ethical concerns and its implications on democracy and mental health. But rather, the focus of this series is on the doctrine and counter operations themselves that call for these tactics to be used. This FM 3-24 doctrine was created for the longest and most expensive war in U.S. history, a war that ended in abject failure. According to Sean McFate of the Atlantic Council, FM 3-24 was almost entirely plagiarized from a French Tunisian named David Galula, And this David Galula character used these tactics to establish colonial rule, not establish democracy. The creation of this doctrine, in order to align with UN resolutions at the time first establishing the International War on Terror, is also very much worth discussing, but unfortunately outside the scope of this series, as is its establishment by the West Point Mafia, the Warhawks, and the, quote, Coindinistas. And because I'm so critical of this doctrine through firsthand experience, I've also included doctrine recommendations within this video series as well. Now, the ethical concerns revolving around many aspects of stability operations did not first start with this highly debated FM3-24 subject of this video series. Now, Dr. Lawrence Yates was a member of the Combat Studies Institute team, or CSI, since the early 1980s and spent decades intensely studying this aspect of Army operations. Now, the CSI publishes official U.S. military-approved literature via the Army University Press. Now, prior to Dr. Yates' retirement in 2005, CSI asked him to write an analysis regarding his impressions formed by his extensive research in this field of stability operations. In this, Dr. Yates affirms the fact that stability operations, quote, involve both coercive and cooperative actions, end quote, and these activities include, quote, support for insurgencies, end quote, and engaging, quote, in psychological operations, or PSYOPs, end quote. Dr. Yates continues, they may occur before, during, and after offensive and defensive operations. However, they also occur separately, usually at the lower end of the spectrum of conflict. He then goes on to say that these stability operations have numbered several hundred. Now, before we jump right into this, I'm just going to mention a little bit about myself. I have an academic background that includes studies in international cyber conflicts, terror and counterterror, strategic communications, as well as the ethical and societal challenges surrounding artificial intelligence. And you can find a bio and my published works through the links in the description. Now, okay, as you may know, this video series will not only cover the FM3-24 doctrine, but it's also going to be the very first video series in the world to cover its ethical concerns, specifically when used within the U.S. to counter violent extremism and, dare I say, in a full tilt to counterinsurgency. So, full tilt, coin FM3-24 wide open. What does that look like inside the U.S.? A battle zone, like Afghanistan, boots on the ground? Not necessarily. Now, this is just some of what this video series will cover. Could it happen? How far off are we? Now, me personally, I posit that the U.S. is either not very far off or currently in the midst of a domestic counterinsurgency military operation right now. Now, why do I think this? Well, there's been an influx of individuals across all political groups who have been incarcerated on domestic terrorism charges stemming from political grievances. And defense advisors and policymakers have determined that the events which transpired at the U.S. Capitol building in D.C. on the first week of January 2021 was an insurrection. Now, we can't be so naive to think that the U.S. is simply doing nothing at all. So, what is the difference between insurrection and insurgency? Where does insurrection lie on the counterinsurgency spectrum? So while insurrections might involve direct confrontations with authorities, insurgencies often use guerrilla tactics and seek to avoid direct engagements unless strategically advantageous. An insurrection is usually a short-term event that may or may not have long-term objectives, while an insurgency is a campaign sustained over a long period of time with long-term objectives and clear political goals going against the state. And as you'll see, this US military doctrine recognizes its own statist nature, affording itself to democracies and authoritarian governments alike in their own domestic insurgent threats. So, while an insurrection can be a component of an insurgency, they are not mutually exclusive. An insurrection could be an isolated occurrence without leading to a prolonged conflict, or it might be a single event within a larger insurgency. The distinction lies in the scope, organization, duration, and objectives. So, with that being said, whether you believe that the US is in the midst of a counterinsurgency operation or that one is not too far off, this series of videos is meant not only to help shed light on this doctrine, but on what this military operation would look like on US soil.